So we made it to the end. We weren't. So I have a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you, loosely themed around Europe. But I wanted to start closer to your homeland, as in of the country. We haven't heard very much about the Koreas today, and I thought if you're thinking about Europe's Asian future, we have no better example than what's currently going on in Ukraine with the 8,000 to 10,000 North Korean troops. And this has, as Nico said in his introduction to the conference, embodied a theme that has been part of this State of Asia conversation about the interrelationship between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. Bruno Messias, in his commentary, made the startling claim that this is the first time in 1,000 years that you've seen an Asian country independently deciding to alter the European security order. So you used to be, I mean, you're now in the far more elevated position of head of the Asia Society, but you used to be even the foreign minister of South Korea, so you're very well placed to give us some context on how you think we as Europeans should interpret what's happening, why this has happened, and what you think the consequences of it are.
Great. Well, thanks, James. You raised so prominently the issue of Korea, and in a way it's reassuring because the list for the survey didn't include Korea. So I thought, did I push my case about a disappearing population too far, and you're already assuming that we no longer exist? Or the question being, which country do we not know enough in light of the importance of that country? So the other interpretation is, you know Korea enough, and perhaps a lot of K-pop content has given you that sense of, we know Korea. But anyway, that's sort of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek. The North Korean troop deployment to Ukraine is not a strategic decision. It's an opportunistic decision by North Korea. So I would not give it too much of a meaning. The initial look of this was mercenaries. Yeah, basically the Russians tried to package them as some ethnic group in the Far East, and you put them in Russian garb and you send them. So they were starting to, according to all the intelligence that we had, as announced by the military intelligence, these were being recruited as mercenaries, right? But the more it made the story, I think they needed to legitimize it, so they've sent But so it's not Asian troops invading in the middle of a European continent. It's an extension of the Russian military endeavor, right? But it does have huge implications for global security concerns. Because the big question from this side is, so what is North Korea getting in return? The North Korea's nuclear and missiles capability are already a global threat. They have the distance to reach anywhere. The only question now about the missiles technology is, do they have the technology for the re-entry? Because if you're talking about an intercontinental ballistic missile, which goes like this, upon re-entry, that warhead has to have the technology that doesn't burn at the moment. And we still question whether North Korea has that or doesn't. But here is an opportunity for Kim Jong-un to ask Russians, say, we will give you our men. Give us this technology, or some important technology that North Korea hasn't had. And if they end up, this bargain with Putin ends up really being a game changer in North Korea's nuclear and missiles capability. It may not be an immediate threat today, but it will be a huge threat in the medium and the longer term for global security. So the implication on the Ukraine war front, I don't think should be read too much into it. Right? Is my sense, and I don't have any privileged information, but I'm reading only the what's being made public by the South Korean and the American authorities.
So one of the more prominent themes, sticking with the North just for a minute, in the first Trump administration, we had some quite eccentric American diplomacy around North Korea, which included the Kim-Trump summit in Singapore. Do you think that, in a sense, we're likely to see more of that, as in, is solving the problems of the Korean Peninsula still on Donald Trump's in tray, or is that something he's moved off?
I think he himself might be interested. He always wanted to prove that he can do it when no other presidents could do it. And if there is a package that makes him look like a big geopolitical success, he might be tempted to do it. But North Korea, I don't think, will be as keen to come back to the table as it was in 2018.
And why is that?
Because it's in a soft spot because of this opportunity created by the war in Ukraine.
Right.
It has a good friend in Russia that gives it what it would need. Used to be China that North Korea largely depended upon. China gave North Korea what it needed, not necessarily because of a huge amount of trust and loyalty on both sides, but because it needed North Korea to be stable. What China seeks in North Korea, and in fact in all of its peripheries, is stability. And if you can't have a regime that's provocative, that's increasingly nuclear capable, and the economy collapses while the regime pursues all of its resources into development, it's a very iffy situation. So I think even under the heaviest sanctions, and these are not unilateral sanctions, these are UN sanctions, the heaviest UN sanctions placed in all of Security Council history, still the lifeline to North Korea was China. Officially not acknowledged, but lots of under the table illicit activities going on both ways.
How does, and just sticking with Korea for one last minute, I mean, how does this look from Seoul? So you were telling me last night that the European hopes that South Korea would use its impressive defense sector to begin to arm Ukraine isn't terribly likely. Nonetheless, you're not too far away from people writing articles about there being a kind of Korean proxy war in Europe at the moment, as in, the sort of the engagement of both the South and the North in Ukraine in different respects. So how does this look from Seoul? Is it sort of really focused on the effect this might have back at home on the Korean Peninsula, or is Seoul now taking a much greater interest in European security affairs as well?
I think that interest in European security affairs has, started long before Ukraine. The relationship between NATO and South Korea has been incrementally increasing, and there was I think observer status or a partnership. I forget the exact word.
AP4.
Yeah.
Sort of.
No, that's more recent.
Right.
But as a bilateral relationship, that relationship been strengthening, and now it become even more solid with the other three countries. So, and it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out. But I think certainly the Ukraine war has jacked up that relationship one step further. But it is still humanitarian assistance, limited to humanitarian assistance going into Ukraine. Lethal weapons assistance, I think it's an open secret. Yes, South Korean shells are going in, but indirectly, because by our own law, we're not allowed to sell lethal weapons unless approved by the National Assembly, and these were never, it's not something that went through the National Assembly. So these are being sent directly to the United States, which is a trusted ally, so there's lots of things going back and forth, and it's the US then sending the South Korean-made shells to Ukraine. But other than that, any kinds of South Korean weapons going into the battlefield in Ukraine has been a non-starter.
Whether in Europe, where most countries are American allies or NATO members, or in Northeast Asia, where the Republic of Korea and Japan both are, the kind of concern now is about the role of the United States. Just prior to the election, you wrote a piece in the South China Morning Post. I don't see Finbar Birmingham here, but give the South China Morning Post its due, where the basic sort of top line from that was the concern about US reliability would be the main reaction in Northeast Asia after Trump election. Could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, US allies are always worried about the US either walking out or in entrapment or abandonment. These two. How do you think that will
well, certainly
develop?
At Trump's level, and he had threatened to pull out. He had threatened to dump all the cost of the troop presence in Korea on South Korea against existing arrangements. But I think, and this is for all alliances, NATO a little bit different. There is very strong congressional bipartisan support for the ROK-US alliance. And so whenever Mr. Trump's threatened to pull the troops out or reduce the number of troops, Congress comes back with their annual spending bill to specify the existing number of troops, and that it will continue to be the case. So I think given that, fundamental basis of bipartisan support for the alliance, the president probably will say a lot of provocative stuff, and that is a concern. But because messages can have real weight when it comes from at that senior level. But in the end, I think the political bipartisan support for the alliance is what we count on to continue.
Right.
Yeah.
With a point made by Adam Tooze in his lecture last night, and to some degree in Zichen's remarks, sort of theme running through the conference has been that we all spend vastly too much time this week, of all weeks, worrying about the intentions of the United States and not enough time trying to understand what's going on in China. As foreign minister and as Asia Society head, you have a lot of interactions with the Chinese system. What is your read on, in a sense, the way that President Xi's government is going to develop over the coming period, as opposed to simply obsessing about Trump?
Well, I think, first of all, I think you just need to take time in reading China's attention. I don't think it's becoming increasingly difficult because open source information, open channels of communications are becoming increasingly restricted. And that's one thing. And I also think that China is going to take its time. The Chinese leadership is going to take its time about how they would respond to the results of this, the election. Of course, they will dig back on their dealings with Mr. Trump in Trump #1. But I think the bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill, this huge anti-China rhetoric, is also not very factual and an overreach, and certainly unhelpful to maintaining a stable relationship between the two big players on the geopolitical space. So, and that is the role of institutions like Asia Society, to provide fact-based analysis of what's going on in China. And we try to do that with information coming from China, coming from within China, and to provide an analysis to that and provide it with whoever is interested in developments in China. And we will continue to do that. We will continue to provide a space for an inclusive dialogue, which could be public, it could be private, and we do a lot of that as well. And so I think that kind of an endeavor is even more important when there's the China rhetoric in Washington, D.C. is so toxic. If you stray from anything other than this huge anti-China as a demon, there's no space almost. And we have heard people coming to say with us, we come here in New York because we can't say anything in Washington.
Right.
Yeah, and so, well, here's, I think this is an opportunity, a change of leadership, always an opportunity to create some space like that, and Asia Society will certainly try to do our role in this moment of a rupture, but also an opportunity.
I mean, I suppose to push you a little bit, I mean, either in your role with Asia Society or as a diplomat, do you see reasons for optimism about the relationship between the US and China? As in, I mean, I don't think anyone thinks it's going to become a kind of great bromance in future, but to even keep the current level of sort of reasonably stable relations, is that something that you feel is a kind of plausible outcome of the current moment?
You know, I always say diplomats are not pessimists, not optimists. We try to make the best of the cards that we're dealt with, and I think that should be the approach that we take going forward.
Okay.
Yeah. That sounds like a cop-out, but I mean, it's the most realistic approach.
Let me ask you a little bit about, before we come on to I'm going to conclude with Europe in all of this, but I wanted to ask about the role of multilateralism. So, I mean, in a sense, you spent a good bit of your career within the United Nations system in human rights, in humanitarian affairs. Throughout this conversation, we have had talk about multilateralism of a sort. The BRICS has come up a lot. Very little discussion of the role of the United Nations or the kind of the major multilateral bodies. I mean, what role do you see? In a sense, is it the case that the multilateral order is hold below the waterline and we're moving into a world in which these institutions are simply less capable? Or would you put it a different way?
Well, I think I mean, the whole UN system is such a behemoth of political bodies, specialized agencies, funds and programs. So there are still certain parts of that system that is functioning, doing its work effectively, and work that is very much needed, especially the humanitarian aid agencies. You think of a world without, for example, the WFP. UNRWA, I think, is a special case, but WHO also, yes, a lot of political fighting there, but at the end, you would think of a world without WHO and the next pandemic strikes, right? So you don't dismiss the whole system because of this dysfunctioning at the core. Yes, it is a dysfunction at the core, and the core is a Security Council dysfunction that is unable to do anything about its mandate, which is about peace and security in the world, right? So yes, that has to be acknowledged, and unless the big players in the Security Council can get their act together, peace and security is going to be left to whatever countries and whatever interested countries are willing to put their political capital at stake to do something about this. And you see all kinds of players saying, I'm going to mediate here, I'm going to mediate there. There are all kinds of forums being created. I'm not sure that's entirely helpful, but because the Security Council is dysfunctional, this is what's happening. And I frankly don't know how to resolve that. So therefore, all the more the reason you really have to prevent sensitive situations from getting out of control and becoming open conflict. Because we're in a situation where the international system is unable to stop conflict and bring peace back. It's really the political will of the individual national level leaders who can do that, because the Global Security Council is unable to do that.
Yeah, I mean, a point Mark Malloch-Brown makes about the UN is that actually the recent history of the UN system has, for most of its history, existed in a world of great power competition. As in, you had the first Cold War, then you had a very brief break at the end of the Cold War, now you have a new period of great power competition. So whatever else you think of it, it is normally used to functioning in a situation in which what really matters is having superpowers not getting on with one another.
But there's one issue that the five Security Council have always worked together on, and that was nuclear nonproliferation, weapons of mass destruction. And that was why they were able to adopt a series of sanctions resolutions on North Korea up to 2017. North Korea continues to provoke. They just saw another ICBM a few days ago. Security Council can't do even because of the Chinese and the Russian veto.
One of the major priorities for European leaders beyond Ukraine, which we've talked about a little bit, is climate change. One of the most arresting arguments that Adam Tooze made in his introductory lecture yesterday was that, in a sense, there's nothing very much that Europeans can do about climate change. In a sense, this is a problem which is going to be solved or not solved in Beijing and Delhi, and you can kind of influence around the edges, but this is out of our hands now. We might have created the problem historically, but solving it, and that's, he argued, very challenging to a European Western mindset that, in a sense, you're now bystanders to history. In your South China Morning Post article, you did talk at the end about the fact that if Trump won, then it would make the climate progress more difficult because of US energy policies and lack of US leadership. We also talked about the issue of we don't really know what China's approach to the next round of COP would be. But I mean, maybe say a little bit about how you see the geopolitics of climate moving forward in this new environment.
Well, I think, you know, under the Biden administration, I think the two sides found a way to talk to each other through their climate envoys, and Asia Society played a big part in being the facilitator of that dialogue. That's probably not going to happen under the new, but there is lots of happening at the sub-national level. And so that needs to be kept going. And I think without China, US leadership, of course the whole climate community will look to China. There will be a lot more pressure on China, not only to deliver its promise to go net zero by 2060, and we will see if that's they're still on course to do that when they come up with their next nationally committed national contributions, and that's to be submitted next year. I think also the COP this year in Azerbaijan, the big issue there is financing. And that has been the most difficult issue that has created this huge distrust between the developing and the developed world, because the developed world promised financing and never delivered. The promise of Copenhagen was met maybe only 1 year out of the many years since then. This year, they're aiming to negotiate a new financing package, a new figure of some kind. And if I hope the developing world is serious when they agreed to some kind of a package coming out of level, because that distrust about the developing countries, you know, basically trying to address that climate injustice by helping the developing countries catch up, both on the mitigation and adaptation front, I think is a test of whether this agenda will succeed or not.
To what extent do you think?
So in that regard, I think, will China step up to the plate and be a leader in this financing discussion? Is a critical point.
So to what extent do you think emerging economies, global South economies, whatever term you want to use, will step into the space that is being vacated by the West to some degree? So you mentioned China in the climate talks. You have China's Global Development Initiative. India's widely admired G20 attracted a lot of attention. Right. We've heard from Dewey today, a new outwardly focused leader in Indonesia with a much greater international profile. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, you know, in a sense you have the larger and middle powers of the formerly emerging world have a much more clout now. Is that going to translate into the solving of, or mechanisms to try and solve some of these international challenges?
I think every country's interest and profile is different. So I don't know if we can count on these newly emerging middle powers with clout to be really doing their part on the climate agenda. I see a lot of them trying to exercise influence in a lot of problem areas around the country, in conflict situations. And I think, so the non-West is very diverse, as Asia is diverse. And in that non-West, you have countries with increasing agencies, and they are trying to exercise that agency in a way that is not necessarily helpful to solving the problems. In conflict, and it's a big question mark whether that that exercise of influence is in a helpful direction in the climate change agenda as well.
Let's conclude our conversation closer to home, as the title says. I mean, you're a South Korean diplomat. You now run an international organization in New York. You spent a lot of time in New York, in the UN, and also here in Switzerland. You've just been on a 2-week tour, much of which has been in Europe. You have offices in France and Zurich and maybe elsewhere soon. What advice would you have for European political leaders? I mean, I think Europe, particularly this week, feels itself caught between the forces of history, sort of stuck between Trump on the one hand and China on the other, incapable, internally divided. You know, it's a time of great anxiety. What advice might you have for anxious Europeans?
Well, I think Europe is greatly welcomed. So certainly that's the point of view from South Korea, which has the most comprehensive FTA with the European Union dating back to, what, 2015 was it? So from South Korea's point of view, Europe is already a very important economic partner. Sharing values, it's a very important political part. I think you could say the same about Japan. But I also see a great deal of openness in Southeast Asia. ASEAN, for example, there is a recent survey of ASEAN about the importance of all of these dialogue partners, and especially in terms of balancing the US and China, the big, heavy-breathing big powers. And who would you count to play the third weight? And Europe comes out very high. So I think there is an expectation and an openness for, and these are not just everyday, people survey. These are ASEAN elites surveyed. So these are academicians, policymakers, business people, and they have a very, openness about the engagements with Europe. So here's a, I think the opportunity is there. And so it's curious that there's a lot of soul searching when the partner on the Asian side is really ready to engage. So I would say just do it. I mean, be confident about what the value of Europe and the values that Europe brings to Asia, as diverse as it is.
And would you like just to close to say a little bit about your plans for the Asia Society? So we've been sitting here today enjoying the hospitality of the Asia Society.
Well,
I forget exactly how long you've been in the hot seat, but
7 months.
So what? By the time we come back here next year for State of Asia, what plans will you be unveiling?
Well, I'm just really impressed with how this conference is run. It's very innovatively, unlike any conference that I've been to, and that's great deal of innovation here, and I think many other Asia Society centers will want to model this.
Also, very good Swiss timekeeping, so that's important.
That's very important. But the host at this magnificent location and the innovative thinking about how we run this it's truly impressive. But I also have learned a great deal about Switzerland, about the European orientation going forward. So for me, it's the education has been the other way around. You came here to learn about Asia.
We have an example of European and Swiss innovation, which is going to be rolled out all the way, including to Asia.
Including to Asia. But Asia societies, I'd say we need to be humble. I mean, we have a huge brand name, which is very well respected. But at the end, we are a nonprofit. We're not government making the policy decision, but we certainly have influence, and we need to be very careful. We need to be very crafty, shrewd, and smart in exercising that influence. And I think this is, enhancing the Asian competency here in Switzerland to people who have a great deal of interest and stakes in the Asian continent is certainly one way to do that.
Very good. Thank you so much. We're standing between you guys and drinks, so thank you very much.
We ended up 30 minutes, 30 seconds in time.